Before we start talking about applications of virtual reality in the field of language and communication, I need to tell you something about exposure therapy in general for a better understanding of how VR is being used as an application. Right, so people, as you know, are afraid of all sorts of things. So some people even have what you could call an anxiety disorder. They're really afraid of something, and this sort of hinders them in their everyday life. So you can think of fear of spiders, for instance, fear of flying, people being claustrophobic. And of course, those things can be treated, right? And in the past, if you wanted one of those phobias to be treated, you would go to a doctor, to a specialist, who would then come up with some kind of therapy. And this therapy could have different forms. Either it could be just talking about your fears, or it could be some kind of exposure therapy. And the idea in exposure therapy is that you're being exposed to the thing that you're afraid of. So in the case of spiders, you would be exposed to spiders gradually. And then in the end, for many people, this actually works. And this therapy is gradual. So for instance, in the first session, you would just be talking about spiders, but in the second session, you would look at a picture of a very nice and friendly spider. And then perhaps in session 10 or so, there will be in the back of the room some actual spider. In the next session, there will be again an actual spider, and this spider would get a bit closer. And because you're exposed to this in sort of a safe environment where you notice that this doesn't really do you any harm. So the spider in the end doesn't seem to be eating you, even though that was your fear. You get sort of exposed to this thing you're afraid of and get used to that nothing bad happens to you. And for many people, this sort of reduces their fears. So that was in the past, and this still happens today. But of course, you can imagine that this comes with all sorts of problems. For instance, in terms of feasibility and practicalities, it's not always easy to get an actual spider into the lab. It's also not always easy, for instance, to expose people to, for instance, fear of flying, because you would need to book an actual ticket, perhaps, and it's very hard to do this in a gradual way. Either you're flying up in the air or you're not flying. Well, VR, in those cases, offers some practicalities that more traditional methods don't. So you can be gradually exposed to the thing you're afraid of in VR. And because this VR experience is so much like the real world, it can be used in exposure therapy. Here's another example. So of course, some people have fear of heights. So they are afraid entering high buildings. They are afraid entering elevators that go up, for instance. Of course, this is also something that can be used, that can be treated in VR, because gradually you can be exposed to certain heights in VR. And you will also notice that nothing bad will happen. And then hopefully this generalizes to the real world, such that also in the real world, you're no longer afraid of heights, because you've practiced, you sort of gotten used to heights in a safe virtual environment. This exposure therapy is also interestingly used in the case of traumas. So for instance, in Albert Rizzo's work in the University of Southern California, they are treating soldiers coming back from, for instance, from Afghanistan and Iraq, who have those traumas, who have very bad traumas. So many of those, they have experienced something during their war that still sort of haunts them once they're back in the US, a very bad experience. And this can also be treated with exposure therapy, but you can sort of imagine that it's very hard without VR to recreate the situation they had been in the other part of the world, right? So it's very hard to expose them to the thing that happened before. Well, in VR, this is something you can do. So what they're doing there is they're exposing those soldiers over and over again to the traumatizing event that they have experienced in their life. And throughout those sessions, this seems to work quite well. So those traumas sort of gradually decrease a little bit, such that in everyday life, those veterans no longer experience those negative consequences of the traumatic event that they have experienced in the past. So really, they wear those glasses and they are again back in Afghanistan or back in Iraq, experiencing the traumatic event that they experienced over there. And because they're sort of gradually exposed to this, habituated to it, the trauma more or less slowly but surely disappears a bit. Yeah, so here's another sort of cartoony version of this, of what they see. So imagine you're in this army vehicle out in Afghanistan, a very traumatic event happens to you. So you're really in shock, and you really, even years later, once you're back, in this case in the US, you still experience the negative consequences of this. You can be treated through this therapy, and that can sort of reduce the everyday consequences that are still there for you. For instance, the number of nightmares that you have can sort of decrease because you're exposed to this over and over again. You sort of habituate to it, you get used to it. And the traumatic effects of the traumatic events sort of gradually disappear.